the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, can I start by acknowledging the member for Barton and congratulate her election to the House, and that I actually don't doubt for one second that the spirit in which she's offered her remarks were well-intentioned and based on the trust that she has in this government. The problem is that that's not actually their practice. I understand when you're a member of the government, particularly when you're new and you want to feel that your government that you've been elected on a platform to support is trying to do the right thing. But of course, as always occurs when with all governments, is eventually their true face is revealed. And of course, what we're seeing more and more with time is the dark face of the Albanese government as the mask slips, and a seemingly well-meaning Prime Minister who jocularly likes to have a beer at the pub, although he didn't actually like to do that, even though he actually did do that when he was claiming he wasn't doing that, but that's a whole separate issue in the lead-up to the 2022 election. I remember seeing him explicitly saying one thing in public and doing something completely different, but we'll leave that to one side. But what we've seen ever since then through the legislation that's put forward before this parliament is the mask is slipping, and we're increasingly seeing the contemptuous quiver of his lip at how dare you Australian people question me, as he periodically jaunts back in from overseas trips on his Air Force jet between visiting Dan Andrews in Victoria or going overseas, and comes back from National People's Congress and thinks, that'd be a really good model to impose on the Parliament of Australia, where people just stand, applaud like trained eunuchs and don't ask or dare raise questions. And this legislation around freedom of information comfortably fits within that, because while the spirit of the speeches from the members of the Labor Party may be intended, anyone who submitted an FOI under this government, or more importantly, other Labor governments in the country, will know how much, on the surface of it, they talk integrity, they spin the idea that they're in favour of transparency, but in practice they weaponise and use it at every point to try and undermine access to information. And I'll give you a classic example of this. Recently, Deputy Speaker, I FOI'd the Department of Health many months ago, asking them information about an MRI machine at Sandringham Hospital. Sandringham Hospital, of course, being in the federal electorate of Goldstein. And I remember in 2017 when an MRI licence was secured for Sandringham Hospital. And it was secured, MRI was secured for the federal electorate of Goldstein when we were last in government. And many people said to me, why didn't you get one for the Sandringham Hospital? Why did you get it for Cabrini Hospital in Brighton? And the answer was, well, because Sandringham Hospital doesn't have an MRI machine. So it's not much use getting an MRI licence for a hospital that doesn't have an MRI machine you can use it on. So it was with fascination that during the lead-up to the last federal election, the former member for Goldstein was going out to the community boasting about how she got this magnificent MRI licence for Sandringham Hospital. And I thought, that's very odd, because as far as I'm aware, alfredhealth.gov.au, the website still says it doesn't have an MRI machine. So, of course, I have then dutifully gone to FOI at health.gov.au. This is one of these mischievous FOIs, how dare people submit, and asked the basic questions. Well, could I have the advice that was given to the department at the time? Could you give me information reflecting what their decision-making, their pricing structures, whether this should be passed? And, of course, what did the research, what did the FOI documents actually show? It showed the department saying, actually, it's quite easy to calculate the cost of bringing forward the MRI licence for Sandringham Hospital, because there's no MRI machine. So what they engaged in was a cruel health hoax that deliberately deceived the people of Goldstein to try and prop up the former member in the hope that they would then go on and get re-elected to help their own electoral fortunes and chances. So, yeah, does FOI have a place? Yes, it has a role to expose the deception and the dishonesty at the heart of this government and, of course, any government that seeks to abuse power. Not only that, the minister was specifically warned. But even worse than that, Deputy Speaker, the FOI went in many months ago. We waited and waited and waited and waited and waited and waited and waited for an answer. Do you know when they released the answer, Deputy Speaker? When they finally gave out the documents, Deputy Speaker. They finally gave out the documents on the Friday evening after the bureaucrats were forced to admit everything I just said before sent estimates. They weaponised and they abused freedom of information to hide information until they could hide it no longer. That is what Minister Butler does. That is what the Prime Minister does. They weaponise laws to shut down access to information from the people of Australia. So when you get a piece of legislation like we're getting with the Freedom of Information Amendment Act Bill 2025, what we know is the Attorney-General is trying to suffocate and silence what is left of the democracy in our country in terms of access to information. We know that she is trying to deceive the public, and they're using the most fantastical and farcical arguments to get there. The argument that is now being put forward by the Prime Minister is that we have to shut down the pathways for freedom of information for ordinary Australians because there might be things to do with national security that are covered. I'd hate to break it to you, Deputy Speaker, if you've ever read the FOI, you will know that it already excludes all of the information around national security. So they say the last resort of a scoundrel is to appeal to national security or patriotism. Well, this government is clearly full of those types of characters because they have simply deceived the public in the hope that they can ram this through and impose their truth tax to shut down and silence information and to cap the volume of information that Australians can get out of it. And they ought to be ashamed of themselves because they haven't consulted, they haven't engaged. There are so many different transparency organisations, anti-corruption organisations, of course the opposition, the crossbenchers, who are increasingly seeing the dark face of this government as well and seeing the mask slip when the Prime Minister gets up in question time, when he occasionally answers questions rather than just through a quiver of his lip shouting abuse back in response. They're starting to see the consequences of what happens when you have a government where the intoxication of power has gone to his head more than, let's just say, a few beers with removal of the excise. What we know is they're shutting down transparency and democratic accountability, and I gave an example just in the context of what's going on in a local hospital in the context of the federal electorate of Goldstein. They're imposing new fees and processing caps to try and silence and limit access to journalists so they won't be able to find out information. They're trying to minimise the capacity for people to be able to get information and silence whistleblowers and vulnerable applicants, because that's what we really need right now, Deputy Speaker. We need more pathways to silence whistleblowers. Why do you think that might be? Do you think it might be that at the moment we have whistleblowers who are standing up and calling out the CFMEU and their administration established by Minister Rishworth and calling out that corruption is actually getting worse under the current government's proposal? But their solution is to shut down whistleblowers, to silence dissent and challenge anybody who stands up and calls out corruption at the heart of this government, because they do not want these voices to be heard, because they know it's not just getting worse, but it's likely to continue to get worse under this regime. And, of course, they want to expand secrecy around cabinet advice, because apparently there's this explosion, Member for Grey, of cabinet advice. It's just around. They can go and pick it up from pieces of paper all around. It's all over the place. So they have to try and somehow minimise it. Cabinet advice isn't publicly available. The idea that they need to somehow constrain this further is farcical. But they are using it to try and expand it so that you can now have it where ministers walk through and say, well, it went through the cabinet room, now it's cabinet advice, you can't access it, to try and continue to silence and limit the amount of available information. And, of course, by putting on caps for the volume of information that you're able to secure and the processing times, of course, what a surprise. Do you think it's possible, Deputy Speaker, that they might turn around and simply say, I think it's going to take a while for us to process this information. In fact, in between my coffee break, going to the bathroom, lunch, it's 5, or maybe we'll count it. It will just get longer and longer and longer, and all of a sudden, boom, we can't give that information, it's too long to process. Get real. The intention of this legislation is clear. The attempt of this government to silence and shut down public scrutiny is real. When you have a truth tax, when you have a silencing and limiting information, and you see the example of their conduct in other arenas from their CFMEU administration, where the minister still takes advice from somebody who self-declares they're so tainted they can't sit on the national executive of the Labor Party, and she still holds that person as an advisor on the National Construction Industry Forum. And funnily enough, that minister is still blocking a public inquiry through the Senate into CFMU corruption, into the regime she has established. You're starting to see the cartel kickback circle of life. This is the problem, Deputy Speaker. This legislation, in theory, is designed to do what they claim it is, which is to simply administratively tidy up the law. In practice, it's a backdoor attack on our democracy, and it needs to be called out, because it will reward delay and dysfunction at every step of the way. It lacks public support. I've yet to find a single person outside of this Albanese government that supports it. No one's coming up to me in the street, Deputy Speaker, going, you know what, I really support how the government is shutting down freedom of information, Deputy Speaker. I think that's a wonderful thing. Not a single person has said that. People have said the reverse. People have said, actually, I don't think this is a good idea. Journalists have certainly said the reverse, certainly members of the opposition, certainly members of the crossbench. In fact, certainly anybody who's actually thought about what this government is doing in their insidious agenda. It goes directly against the proposition this government came to office in saying they would somehow have integrity and be fulsome in providing information to the public. We all know that's just complete fantasy now. It was a proposition put at the time, but no one actually believes it. I don't think even they believe it themselves, to be fair, Deputy Speaker, but I wouldn't want to verbal them. They should just be shamed by their conduct. But more importantly, what it actually does is it damages public trust, because around this country, we have so many Australians who already have deep distrust of institutions, and the one surefire way to guarantee that is to shut them down and to limit the access and accountability that they have. To make it even harder for agencies to be held accountable, not just from the public, not just from the journalists, but from the ministers themselves, certainly from parliamentary processes. And if the minister and the members of opposite were so enthused and so enthralled by standing up for public scrutiny and accountability, the first thing they could do is start by saying that a lot of these rules simply shouldn't apply to those people elected to public office to hold the government specifically to account, and certainly to the journalists whose job it is to shine bright lights into very dark crevices. But let's face it, Deputy Speaker, nobody wants to know what's going on in the dark crevices of this government. We have increasing bureaucracy and legal complexity deliberately designed to obfuscate and to make it more complicated to be able to find information. And for what purpose, apart from the secrecy that this government seeks to impose? There is a better way, Deputy Speaker. We actually can conserve the existing laws. There is no national security threat, despite the pontificating of the Prime Minister, who's come back from overseas and, as I've said too often, is trying to find justifications to shut down accountability around this parliament and the government and the operations of the Commonwealth of Australia. We can have a better way. We can have laws that work, that enable access to information and give people access to the information they need to be able to hold this government to account. We don't need to indulge the fantasies of the Albanese government and those who wilfully come into this chamber with the delusion of thinking they're doing the right thing when in fact they're actually entrenching the sort of corrupt governance system that they claim they're seeking to oppose. We have choices, Deputy Speaker, as a nation, about the type of country we want to be. And we want to be one which is focused on making sure there's transparency, accountability and decision-making, because it's important not just for the ministers but for the bureaucrats themselves that they understand that through the systems of government that there is accountability for their decision-making. Nobody should be embarrassed by the process of making decisions. It's about making sure they're properly informed, that they're properly respected, and of course that people have input into the processes of government. Because the right of every Australian is to be able to ask challenging and difficult questions to their government, because I'd hate to break it to the members of the government, the people have a government, it is not the other way around. Citizens have a government, it is not the other way around. We are not your serfs. Our job is not to comply. Your job is not to control the citizens of this country.
A division has been called for in that... sorry? Goldstein, please continue.
And Deputy Speaker, it comes down to a simple proposition, which is we face choices. The choice is simple. I fundamentally believe that we should have legislation that improves this country and the governance framework that we have. That means we build out a better future for our children and our grandchildren, and we do not hand to them a state of silence as the Albanese government would like to achieve. We stand for a nation that is built on structures and protection of accountability, and that is making sure that we stop these types of bad laws.